What is religion? Now, I'm sure the secular world would say religion is a belief in God, or belief in a creator, or your religious practices to appease the gods, different things like that. And yeah, I would say that those are true in a way. I would not agree with the concept of believing that there is a God being religion. What a lot of people don't realize is religion is actually man's version of God. It is man who's created the gods of different cultures and groups. It is man who has created the ceremonies and practices to appease the gods and the different things like that. God set up a very clear listing of ceremonies and things in the Old Testament that were to be done to honor him. But God wanted a relationship. He wanted to talk directly to man, but man has constantly put barriers between them. If you remember Mount Sinai, after the Exodus, children of Israel go wander in the desert, go to Mount Sinai. God was going to talk directly to them, and they said, "No, if God talks to us, we will surely die." And they pretty much refused to talk to God. They insisted that God set up a system of prophets to talk through. Again, putting that barrier in place. With these ceremonies and rituals God did set up, man has repeatedly exercised his rebellion in fighting against those. For example, if you remember the woman at the well in John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, and as soon as it comes out that he's a rabbi, teacher, or prophet, she instantly goes into religious debate mode. She wanted to argue where is the proper place to worship God. Our ancestors worshiped God on the hills, as we do. What do you say? And going back in time, what was going on with the whole setup there is God had them set up altars to worship him on the hillsides until the temple was built. Once Solomon built the temple, he said, this is God speaking, here is where I am to be worshipped. Here, Jews, man's rebellion, continued to honor God by doing the sacrifices, but in rebellion, saying we're going to do it on the hillside because we don't want to walk all the way over there. That's too hard. That's too difficult. This is the way we always did it before. Why all of a sudden can't we? Because God said to obey me and do it over here. So man has always put up these barriers of religion coming between his own worship of God. And in regards to their sacrifices, if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 15 verses 22, is the Lord as delighted with your burnt offerings and sacrifices as he would be with your obedience? To follow instructions is better than sacrifice. To obey is better than sacrifice the fat of rams. God's saying, I want your obedience. God wanted a relationship. He created mankind for a relationship. In the creation account, in Genesis chapter 1, mankind had a lot more thought put into his creation. The animals, he has kind of spoke into it, a lot of general things. Man, he put thought into, he put focus. He paid attention to these details. It comes out a lot clearly that man was created with a lot more thought and work. He did not want wind-up toys. He wanted that relationship. In that relationship, man rebelled, man ran away, man hid. The whole fall of man took place. So God repeatedly wanted a relationship, and man keeps putting this religious practice. And you actually see that to this day. And this is where it's funny, to me anyway. I have been to almost, I'm reluctant to say every, because I'm sure some church out there, I haven't been to a service or denomination. There might be something, but almost all of them. I've been to some kind of service at least once, ranging from Pentecostal, charismatic, all the way over to traditional services. And it's just as religious to say you cannot raise your hands or sing or dance as it is to say you have to. Anytime there is a rule, a regulation, a ceremony, a requirement, that comes in and creates that ceremony. And that ceremony then becomes a ritual. That ritual then becomes a religious practice, and that religious practice becomes something dead to God. I have seen churches where they were more interested in carrying on with their traditions, even if you show them biblically that they were outright in sin. It was not in the Bible. To do so and to claim that it was in the Bible was not, because nowhere in the Bible is anything to support it. I was not in this meeting when it happened, but I know of somebody who knows somebody that this happened. The person said, "I don't care what the Bible says, we're not going to do it." This was in a church leadership meeting. Clearly, they have stated as their goal is to do what they want to do, not what God wants. I don't think that was intentional. I don't think that was their conscious goal. What started off as a practice that reminded them of God became God. In my own life, every morning, almost every morning, sometimes I miss it, sometimes I do variations on it, but there's a prayer I try to do every morning. And it is basically, "Lord, I give you today. I place my wants and desires aside to do your will. Speak to me, Lord, for your servant is listening." Then I might add some things in there about, work and different things to help me do well, to be an asset to the company or where I work, and different things like that, to be a good representation of Him, things like that. What that is something that helps remind me that this is God's day, not mine. It's not my place to complain. It is something God created, and He wants me to go through it and shine His light in this dark world. That's what I do. It's what He called me to do. It's not my place to complain. It's not my place to tell Him what I will or will not do. If I'm surrendered to Christ, I lost all rights to that. Basically helps me recenter and avoids a lot of temptations. Now, if saying that ritual becomes mandatory, where I have to do this every day, I have to quote it in its entirety, exactly word for word, otherwise God may not be honored. It's just a saying. But I have seen people where they put these simple little things as ritual they must do. Otherwise they have failed as a Christian. They must do this, they must do that, they have to do this, they have to do that. If a practice is something you do to help remind you to be a good Christian, to honor God, there's nothing wrong with it. If it becomes a mandatory, locked-in ritual that we must do, you're not a good Christian unless you dress a certain way, raise your arms in service, dance with a banner or tambourine, whatever it is. Or to the other extreme, you're not a good Christian if you do this or do that. You're not a good Christian if you do that. In order to be a good Christian, you have to stand there sour-faced, basking in God's presence. You cannot move a muscle because that's dishonoring to God. It's just as religious. I actually did see a situation. This was back in the days before cell phones, and certainly before cameras were as easy to take pictures of. But I was in a church service where there were two people there that were not, they were accustomed to a different style of worship. And they sat there with these sour, I would dare say angry faces, disgusted at other people having the nerve to raise their hands in worship, singing songs unto God. Everyone else was enjoying God's presence, feeling Him in the sanctuary. God was moving. It was great. And you look over at these two sour faces sitting there, arms folded, just disgusted that these other people, these claiming to be Christians, doing all this stuff to claim to worship God. It was hilarious to watch them. It was something to just try to keep from laughing. To them, I'm sure they saw it as a reverence, a respect. You sit there and just in God's presence. You don't raise your hands, you don't dance, you don't do anything. That's religious dogma. That's religious ritual. That's religious silliness. God created us for a relationship. It's what you're comfortable with. It's what you like. If you don't like to dance or raise your hands, do all this different stuff, that's fine. As long as your heart is in the right place, worshiping God, you're fine. If you believe God's worth getting excited over you want to do that stuff, that's fine. If you believe that it is respectful, reverence, whatever you want to put in there, and to worship God in a certain way, a certain tempo, if your attitude, if your heart is right, that's fine. It's legalism when you say you have to. You cannot. And only God knows the heart. If somebody's doing some of that stuff with the wrong attitude, we don't know. We cannot judge the other person's attitude. There are things that based on what they say and do, sometimes we'll be able to figure out what their attitude is. But indeed, that is God's prerogative. That is God's area. He looks at the heart. He is our judge. And I have heard people say, God's my judge, and they go off and do whatever they want. Truth be told, that should terrify them with the attitude of they're going to do whatever they want, and only God can judge me. Yeah, that should terrify you. God is your judge. He will look at your heart. He will see exactly what and why you do. And so you should make sure your attitude is with the purest of motives. Because God knows you can't fool him. And there's more than one story on that. But looking at Luke chapter 6, verse 46, God says, "Why do you call me Lord, but do not do what I tell you?" It's so many times this religious fervor gets in the way of doing what God has told us to do. And continue on with that, Luke chapter 6, verse 47 through 49, "I will show you that everyone who comes to me hears what I say and obeys it is like. He is like a person who dug down to a bedrock and lays the foundation of his home. When a flood comes, the floodwaters push against the house, but the house could not be washed away because it had a good foundation. The person who hears what I say but doesn't obey is like someone who built their house on the ground without any foundation. The floodwaters pushed against it, and the house quickly collapsed and was destroyed." If you have the religious ceremony as your foundation, this is what you are. Children grow up in that and often do one of two things. If they don't break away from it and reestablish their own relationship with God, they will either grow up and be Pharisees, legalistic, demanding what things have to be done and cannot be done. It's that attitude that you get the only true Christians go to this denomination or that denomination or carry on this type of format of service. And I have heard people say it's a sin to have a worship service outside of this format. It has to be exactly like that. Well, first off, that format's nowhere in the Bible. You're bringing things outside of the Bible into the Bible and claiming it to be there, and it's not. But the attitude, it's sheer legalism. Or the children will grow up in that, see the hypocrisy, and leave. Walking away from church and God, calling the whole thing hypocrisy. And it is that heresy that is killing so many of the churches. Also, you hear it so often in evangelistic calls that God's knocking at the door of your heart. Won't you let him in? And yes, that's true, and it's a great evangelistic tie-in. But are you aware that the verse that's being quoted there is Revelation chapter 3, verse 20? "Look, I'm standing at the door and knocking. If anyone listens to me, hears my voice, and opens the door, I'll come in and we'll eat together." God's saying this to the church. This is in one of the letters to the 7 churches in Revelations. God's saying, let me in. How many times have we locked God out of our churches? So that's the main point I wanted to get to, and went a little long for my preferences. But it is something that I think needs to be addressed. So until next time, God bless.